your name, school or organization, your grade levels, anything else you want us to know, just as a way to say hello. So I'll give you about 30 seconds or a minute to do that.
While you're doing that too, I forgot to let you know that we are recording this so that if you have colleagues who couldn't be here today or other folks that you know who might be interested in it, this will be on our mathmodels.org website. And we are very grateful to COMAP for sponsoring these webinars.
All right, so I'll start moving forward, but again, please put your name, and I see we've got Christy from Wilson, who's taught at a few different levels, it looks like, and very interested in social justice. Great, so I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this. And anyone who joins us, please feel free to put your info in the chat. And again, if you have questions, just let Maria know. I'll try to monitor the chat, but also she can let me know. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my work in context to start. I'm at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. That's in the southeast corner of the state, and we're in rural Appalachia, and we're in the poorest county in the state. I teach a variety of courses, but in terms of the work that I'm going to talk about today, most of it comes from my math methods course for future middle school teachers or middle grades teachers. In Ohio, that's grades 4 through 9. I've also run summer camps for middle school students with my colleague, Dr. Courtney Kessler, and I'll share some examples of student work from one of those camps today. And then just so you know, in terms of our standards, Ohio was a Common Core state. We adopted the Common Core back in 2010. But then in 2017, we updated or modified the standards. Most of those changes were specific to content standards. So the modeling component of the Common Core is the same, both as a standard for mathematical practice and the high school conceptual category. That stayed there, so that looks the same as it does in the Common Core. As Maria said, I do work in equity and math education, and I think about this in a few different ways, just so you have a sense of some of the stuff I do. First off, I think a lot about equitable participation through complex instruction. I think of complex instruction in terms of really careful design tasks or design of tasks. So thinking about how do we make tasks that are really accessible to all of our students and tasks that elicit really high levels of participation from all our students. And then also in terms of teacher moves or pedagogical moves that the teacher can make that are designed to, one, publicly highlight how all students have something to contribute. So really everyone in the classroom sees that everyone has something valuable to contribute, and moves that really reinforce this collaborative and participatory nature of the task. I also, especially when I'm thinking about preparing future teachers, talk a lot about thinking about how can we view students in terms of their strengths. And for me, this means both their funds of knowledge, which is strengths that we might think of as outside the classroom, their skills or knowledge or resources that they have, that their family has, that their community has, as well as their mathematical strengths. I try to talk to my future teachers about how starting with what students can do or what students know and building from there is a more productive way to approach teaching. And then finally, I focus on the role of mathematics as a tool for understanding social and political issues. Sometimes this is referred to as teaching math for social justice or critical mathematics, and that's really going to be more of the focus today. I see both of these first two, or these second 2 points, as a place where a lot of math modeling can come in, because there's real connections to the real world. And we want to think about how we can mathematize those and build on that. Right, so people who are viewing this have probably thought some about the math modeling process. The more I've thought and learned about modeling, the more I've realized there's lots of different ways to think about it. So I do think it's important for me to kind of lay out how I think about modeling in my own work. But also, if you're not familiar with it, hopefully it's a nice introduction to those ideas. So there are lots of representations or different frameworks for thinking about math modeling. These are just a few that I pulled from a couple of different papers, just to highlight the variety and complexity of ways people have of thinking about the math modeling process. When I'm working with teachers, with future teachers, and with students, I typically use the framework that's in the Common Core. And in part, that's just because it's in our standards in Ohio also. So there's some expectation that we should see this in the classroom. And one thing I like about this framework is that it's relatively straightforward. But one downside of that is that it means it does sometimes miss some of the complexity of how modeling plays out in practice. So in the Common Core, as you can see, there's these 6 components or steps in the process of modeling. And I just want to briefly talk about how I think about each of these. So usually we start with some kind of real world problem we want to solve, or in my mind, it's not always a problem that needs to be solved, but sometimes there's just a phenomenon that we want to better understand. And we think mathematics can help us understand what's going on there. At this point, you may do some research, you may collect data, you might start to make some assumptions about how you're going to think about the context. However, a lot of times in my own work and in classrooms, this is going to be, in some amount of this is going to be done for the student. I might say, here's the data we have for this problem. We don't necessarily have time to go out and do all the research, although you will see some examples of how people might collect additional data to unpack a problem. And then you formulate your model. This is where you sort of put your model together. You have to make some assumptions. You have to select what kind of real world variables you want to plug into your model or make it work. And you have to decide on the specific math you're going to use. Now, for me, a really critical part of math modeling is that there's some level of messiness, and that therefore there's a need to make some decisions and choices. Students have to make decisions about how to understand, interpret the context itself, and decisions about what math they're going to use and how they're going to use that math to analyze the context. So if the need to make choices isn't present, for example, maybe there's kind of one main way to interpret or understand the problem and one main way to approach it mathematically, then for me, that would usually pull it out of the realm of math modeling. Now, not everyone thinks about modeling the same way, and that's perfectly fine. It's just, for me, that's one of the key features I look for, is the need to make some choices and decisions. That can make addressing specific standards really difficult, especially specific content standards, because if the task is really open to multiple approaches, then students might not use the math that we were hoping for. But I see that as an inherent part of modeling and something that we need to embrace and not something that we need to shy away from. All right, so then after you've put your model together, you carry out some calculations or do some computations based on your model. Essentially, you run the model to see what it gives you. You look at the results of that and say, okay, what do these mean back in the real world? And then you say, do these results make sense? And in particular, are they helpful or useful? You're thinking about that problem you had or the phenomenon you're trying to understand, and sort of evaluating whether the model is really helping you do that. And of course, this looks like it's sort of a pretty straightforward process, but in practice, I think you're doing lots of little loops here of formulating, interpreting, validating, and then adjusting your model over and over again. It's not sort of a one and done sort of process. And of course, after you validate, if you have some issues, you might have to go back and either tweak or completely reformulate and repeat the process, or you report out to a relevant audience, which includes both your process and your assumptions and then your findings. In my work, that audience is usually the classroom community. Sometimes we have sort of a hypothetical or imagined audience. All right, so let's talk about 2 example tasks I've done with my students. The first one is about a living wage, and I think we'll spend a little more time on this and thinking about ideas from you all about how you might think about this task, and then we'll talk about a school segregation task. So the crux of the task is about determining what a living wage a family would need and comparing that to the minimum wage. So by living wage, I mean the wage needed to cover sort of your basic expenses. I've done lots of versions of this task over the years. There's a version of it in a book I've written with my colleagues, Ksenia Simic-Muller and Jose Maria Menendez. I've done versions of it with future teachers, pre-service teachers, with current teachers, in professional development settings, and in a summer camp for 7th and 8th graders. And I'm going to try to share some examples from the summer camp in particular. All right, so the task is to figure out the hourly wage, the dollars per hour that workers in a family would need to cover their basic expenses. And it's a hypothetical, and it's a hypothetical family. So I'm not asking them to figure it out for their particular family. I'm going to give the students a scenario. Maybe they're in a family where it's just a single adult. Maybe they're in a family where there's 2 adults and both of them work and they have 2 kids. So I would generally break students up into groups of 4, and each group would be assigned some kind of scenario, and then they'd get some data. So to start the task, I usually begin with some kind of initial brainstorming. When I did in the summer camp, for example, I used that top question. I asked students to think about what are the essential costs that a family might have to pay for. Last time I did this with undergraduates, I asked them to think about what kind of information we need or what we would need to consider. So in the chat, or you could possibly use raise hand and Maria might be able to unmute you. If you could share some ideas about how you would respond to these questions. What are some costs we need to think about that families have to pay for? If we're going to try to find this living wage, what kind of information do you need and what kinds of things do you need to think about? All right, we've got housing, food, utilities. We've got rent or mortgage, food, clothing. Cost in your area. Great. I'm going to move forward, but if you want to put a few more in the chat, you're welcome to. Here are some things that in the summer camp, fees for sports or activities, great one. Here are some things in the summer camp that the kids came up with. Groceries, water and electric bills, mortgage or rent, and car loan or leases, home, car, and health insurance, school fees, medical bills, debt, such as school loans or credit cards, furniture, and clothing. And then when I do this with undergraduates, some of the types of things that often come up are things like the size of the family, the ages of the people in the family, excuse me, any childcare needs, location. And this, like I said, this came up in the chat, the cost in your area. Generally, adults are a little more aware of the fact that different cities or different parts of the country might cost more or less to live in. Healthcare costs, transportation, education, phone, TV, and internet plans, things like that. So those are some of the types of things that come up when we brainstorm this initially. And then I tell the class that we're going to use data that come from something called the living wage calculator. I've got the information up here on the screen if you're interested in it. What the living wage calculator does is breaks down information by location. So it does take into account cost in your area. It usually works at the level of the county, which is in Athens County. That's what we use as our Athens County data. But for some large cities, it also has city-specific data. And they break the cost down into these categories. So we would also usually talk about where the things on our list would fit on the living wage calculator's list. But for food, they're using an estimate based on a lower cost food plan from the United States Department of Agriculture. And that plan assumes that you're making all your meals at home. For the family scenarios that have 2 kids, they're assuming you have a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old. For housing, they're looking at the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. They're looking at their fair market rent values for the location or area. The civic one is actually new. It's not in the examples I'm going to share, but it's a new category that they've added that looks at the cost of engaging in sort of enriching activities that enrich the lives of Americans. And then there's an other category in taxes. And of course, the website will actually calculate the living wage for you. I don't give them that part of it. I just give them this set of the data. So again, usually these are the family types that I will usually pick from the website to give data to different groups in the classroom. And if I have enough groups, it can be nice if, say 2 groups have the same family so that we can see different approaches that students might use. So for example, if the family that I gave a group was 2 adults where both of them are working with 2 kids, they would get data that might look something like this. And these are the estimates that this website has come up with from various economic sources and data sources. So you can see in this picture some kids working in our summer camp, and I actually gave them in the summer camp, this whole table has all these different family setups, which you don't need to be able to see the exact numbers, but the different columns in the table correspond to different types of families. And then whether the group was the hexagon group, the triangle group, rhombus, or trapezoid, they were assigned a specific family. But if they finished early, they had the opportunity to look at other families. And you can also see that we have calculators available. For me, the focus of the task is more on the process and the conversation around a living wage and how we would figure that out, not on the specifics of the calculations per se. All right, so again, the task is to determine the hourly wage for your hypothetical family. And I've got the data down here in the corner for this hypothetical family with 2 adults where they're both working and they have 2 kids. So in the chat, if you could, or raise your hand if you want to share some ideas about how would you approach this problem? What kinds of assumptions would you want to make in going about figuring out what the hourly wage this family would need?
I just want to remind folks too, when you type in the chat, make sure that it says to panelists and attendees so everybody can see your response, please.
All right, so we've got the idea that we're looking at consistent values or bills each year or month. The question is, do both adults work 40 hours per week? That's one of the central assumptions that students really have to grapple with, is how many hours a week are we going to assume people are working? All right, so if people have other ideas, you can add them to the chat, but I'll also share some of the strategies that I tend to see when I do this activity. We've got another one about, is a child in childcare full-time? Is another in an after-school program? So those are good questions about the assumptions in terms of the data that we're given. So here are some strategies I've seen. These span from things I've seen with kids, practicing teachers, and future teachers. First off, almost every group starts by adding up the total expenses for the year. So just to go back for a second, they essentially add up the values in this table to get the total. That's a common first strategy. There's one more great comment in the chat was, in this scenario, are we assuming both adults make the same wage? And I will say most people who tackle this problem for this scenario where you have 2 working adults do make that assumption, but that's a great question. Anyway, so most people start by adding up to find the total expenses for the year. Not everyone does this, but most groups, one of the next steps they do is try to figure out how many weeks in a year do you work. People either know or will Google and find out that there's 52 weeks in a year. And so one option is for people to say, we're going to have them work 52 weeks a year. They're not going to take any time off. They don't usually bring it up on their own, but if I prod, sometimes they say, okay, well, we'll give them 2 weeks off, but it'll be paid. So it's like they're working 52 weeks or some amount of paid vacation. Although I will say, when we do this, paid vacation does not seem to be all that popular. Another common assumption is to say, well, we'll give them, say, 50 weeks. We'll assume that they're going to take off about 2 weeks or maybe 4 weeks or whatever number they choose, but that there's going to be some time off for vacations, for holidays and things like that, but it will not be paid. And then another strategy I see fairly often is to work kind of from months. So people will say there's about 4 weeks in a month, there's 12 months in a year, therefore they're working 48 weeks. And sometimes when a group does this, they realize that they've lost 4 weeks somewhere, that they're not counting the full year. But often they're not quite aware of that. And so it's something that can come up as we compare strategies or as I'm circulating and talking to different groups about how long a year is or things like that. And then the next sort of chunk that a lot of groups tackle is how many hours are you going to work in a week? A lot of people know that 40 hours is considered normal or full-time work week. Some groups, when they actually start to calculate what their wage needs to be to get by, they start to up the hours because the wage is a little high. And so they up the hours to sort of, make up for the difference. If that happens, either through class discussion or discussion with individual groups, I want to try to probe them to think about, okay, well, how would that affect other costs? For instance, the childcare values that you're given, if you have kids in childcare in your scenario, the assumption is that it's sort of a normal work day of childcare. It's not covering, say, 45 or 50 hours of work throughout the day. So you want to think about how that would affect that cost. Or if you're working multiple jobs, how would that affect transportation costs? And then another issue to bring up would be overtime. A lot of people don't think about the idea that if it's one job and you're working more than 40 hours, typically you would get paid overtime for hours that are over 40. So you get time and a half. One thing that sometimes comes up from students, especially if I'm working with, say, undergraduates or practicing teachers who have a little more experience in the world might point out that it's actually pretty hard, or it can be quite difficult to get 40 hours at a kind of entry level hourly wage type position, and especially might be hard to get more than 40 hours. So those are things that we might talk about in terms of the real world. I wanted to share one example solution from a group from the summer camp. So they have their family portrait down here in the corner. Their scenario was one adult and two kids. So they interpreted that as a working mom and two kids. They had an initial strategy, which was where they wanted the adult to work a lot. Originally, they had the adult working 350 days a year for 8 hours a day each day. So essentially 0 time off, not even weekends. And after being pushed a little bit on that, they adjusted. And instead they decided that she would work 261 days, which is really about 52 work weeks with weekends off, for 8 hours a day. And so then their method was to add all the money up and divide by the number of days, divide by the 261, and then divide that by the 8 hours per day. And they came up with a value of around $21 for an hourly wage. Another strategy I see fairly often is a guess and check strategy. So this group, their scenario, their total expenses was about $57,000. And it's not written on this page that I have a picture of, but they did have 2 workers in this family, and they did split it where they assumed each worker made the same amount, and so they both had to contribute half. Their scenario was that they would give them 4 weeks off of unpaid time. So they were only working 48 weeks out of the year, but they assumed they were working 45 hours a week. And then they did a guess and check strategy. So here we have the 8 for $8 an hour, and that would give them 17,000, which is not enough to meet their 28,500. So that gets an X. They tried out $12 an hour. They tried out $15 an hour, which was high enough. They went down to 14 and down to 13. So that's another strategy I see, is where instead of sort of dividing and finding the answer, people use a guess and check with the wage and see if it gets them enough money. In terms of the modeling process, I think of this as a kind of introductory modeling task, or a kind of light modeling. There's not a ton of assumptions. Most of the assumptions revolve around the number of hours worked. Validation is really focused on, are the data that we have reasonable? Are my assumptions reasonable? The computation side is pretty minimal. It does connect to standards involving money, which are more, those were added to the Ohio standards, and then to standards related to multi-digit and decimal computations. But essentially, I see this more as about the process and starting to learn how to make assumptions, and the idea that there may be more than one way to think about a real world context. In terms of discussion around a task like this, one of the things I do encourage students to think about is the reasonableness of the data that they have from the website, the Living Wage Calculator. So for instance, one of the things I usually ask people to think about is the data about meals. If you work out the numbers, the meals are really about $25 a day for a family of 4, and that's just over $2 a meal per person. When I do this with undergrads, that's usually a pretty surprisingly low number for most of them, because they imagine, running to a restaurant and getting something to eat. And, that seems like a low value, $2 for a meal. Some of them might have more experience, grocery shopping, couponing, preparing meals at home, and they see it as something that's doable. But in either case, unpacking what the values are and if they're reasonable or not, at least helps us understand what they represent. This really highlights that it's not a meal plan where you're going out to dinner on a regular basis at all. It really is assuming you're carefully shopping and keeping that and preparing your meals at home. In class, we would have calculated our own values. Of course, each group would have calculated these, but since we haven't done that in this webinar, here are the values that the Living Wage Calculator provides for the most recent year. And so again, these would vary depending on the specific assumptions students in your class had made, but this gives you an idea of what the living wages are for each scenario. In contrast, the current federal minimum wage is $7.25, and the current Ohio minimum wage is $8.70. In Ohio, our minimum wage goes up automatically with inflation, but it's still quite a bit lower than these values, and therefore will stay lower because it won't catch up. One of the central questions, or sort of the central question I really want students to start to talk about, is how should we set the minimum wage and why? The math here can't really answer this question for us, but what it can do is help us have that conversation or provide data or insight into that conversation. And that's part of how I think about using math to explore social and political issues or to model real world phenomenon, is that it might not always be able to answer the question for us, but it can really help us understand it and contribute to that conversation. Another question I often ask is like, what additional data would you want if you're deciding how to set the minimum wage, or what are we missing from our analysis? So in this work so far, for instance, we haven't looked at government benefits such as housing or food assistance. That has been left out of this analysis. So using the chat, or even if you want to raise hands, if you want to share some thoughts on these questions, what do you think about, or what does this task make you think about how we set the minimum wage and why, or what information you would want, or what kinds of conversations might you want to have with students around this type of topic if you were doing this task? Okay, well, so if you think of ideas that you want to share, please feel free to add them in the chat. We've got one, sorry, discussion about ages of entry-level workers and their wages. Great, that's actually what I was going to bring up. So one things that comes up, let me just read the full comment. Discussion about ages of entry-level workers and their wages versus adults who have been working, various types of jobs and what they pay. So that is something that comes up, especially in public discourse, is a lot of people they don't necessarily think of minimum wage as meant to support a family. They think of it as maybe an entry-level position for, say, like a high schooler or something like that. And that's something we could collect data about, especially if we have more time, about who actually is earning the minimum wage, and whether it's a lot of high school workers or whether there's a lot of adults trying to support families who are still in these sort of entry-level positions. And in fact, there are data on that, and that it's another thing I do sometimes is I share the original reasoning behind the minimum wage and what it was expected to do, which was that it was expected to support a family, and how minimum wage has not caught up or has not kept pace with inflation over time. Various types of jobs and what they pay, that's a great thing. And I don't know, I'll go back a couple slides. These students actually had chosen a job that they thought might be reasonable for their person in the scenario to work. And sometimes students will do that. I think they're a little more inclined to think through a scenario than adults might be. And so that's the living wage calculator does list common occupations and some of the wages you would expect with those. All right, great. So next I want to talk a little bit about a school segregation task that I've done. This is a task I've only done in my math methods classes with undergraduate future teachers. So I don't have kids examples with this one. The central task is to think about Hamilton County, which is shown on the map here in red. This is Ohio, this is Hamilton County. Athens County, by the way, is right here. Hamilton County is over here. That's where Cincinnati is. So the county is concerned with school segregation. They hired you to help them determine if they should be worried about the levels of racial or ethnic segregation across the school districts within their county. Work as a group to decide what to tell Hamilton County. Your response must include a strong mathematical justification. So this is an example where when we share in class, we'll share with the classroom community, but we have a sort of imagined audience as though the county has hired us to think about these issues. Here's a map of Hamilton County, just so you can see this is a breakdown of the school districts. I actually, one of the times I did this, I was asked for a copy of the map and I had to run and make photocopies so people could use it and mark it up. I think one group at one point shaded different districts to show how they were rating them essentially. One thing that's interesting is, or to be aware of, often when we look or when social scientists look at school segregation, we're looking at the level of the school or sometimes even the classroom. But what I've done here is I've selected data that's at the level of the school district. Now, part of the reason I did this was mathematical. I can get school level data for every school in these districts. For instance, before I've looked sometimes at Cincinnati Public Schools, which is the largest of these districts. But that data set's really big, and it's a little too big, I think, for my undergraduates to typically process and handle, especially in the time I have. In the past, I've just selected a few schools for them to look at, but that data set's often a little too small where they feel like they want to know about all the other schools in the district. So partially from a math perspective or from a math lesson perspective, it just feels like the right level of complexity. And again, especially for the amount of time I have for this task in my methods course, which is usually about either 2 90-minute periods or 1 3-hour period. And in terms of the real world, there are some advantages and disadvantages to also breaking the data up like this. So again, social scientists tend to look more at the school or classroom level. But part of what looking at the district level does is help show how school segregation is also connected to broader segregation trends within our society. So the students get data that look like this handout, and they would also get a copy of this data in a spreadsheet, usually Google Sheets, so they can all access it and manipulate the data however they want, create graphs, do things like that. The terms I have here for race and ethnicity, and I would tell my students this also, those are the terms that the state uses. So I just use the same terms that they did. I do think it's important if you're going to talk about race and ethnicity to break down or unpack a little bit what these terms mean. Some of the prompts, you might give to students are things like, where do these terms come from? Or what do you know about where they come from? What do each of these terms mean? Who decides on these terms when we collect data? And why might some people be uncomfortable with how they're labeled by the government? So again, using the chat or raising hands, if you want to share either any questions you have about these terms, I'll say they're confusing and I read about them and update my understanding of them fairly often, but they are confusing. Or things that you would want kids to think about if they were tackling data like this before necessarily getting the data, but just to make sure they understand the terminology and the ways it's both, that it can be problematic. So I'm going to pause. I did catch a comment in the chat from earlier about can we have a voice in encouraging folks to increase the minimum wage, about the minimum wage task. And that's a great thing to be thinking about too with tasks dealing with real world issues about how we can think about taking action or what actions we can take. Do we want to write letters? Do we want to inform people in the community? Things like that. Back to this topic, we have a comment about, do students self-identify or does another person identify as students? So who's choosing these terms? I believe that in Ohio, it's mostly self-reported by the family, by the parents or guardian, not by the student. But who's selecting which option for the kid? That's a great question. Someone pointed out that they appreciate that I use the terms that the state does and that we review them and talk about them. Yeah, I think it's really important. Some of the terms can be problematic. One of the things that people might be uncomfortable with is that they might not identify with those terms. I think that gets to both of these comments. So Asian in particular is a term that more recently we tend to break into Asian and Pacific Islander as 2 separate groups. But even within each of those groups, there is a huge amount of diversity within any of these groups. And Hispanic is another term that is complicated and people don't always identify with in the way that it's used. There's a question, would you give students a chance to change the terms to something that is more meaningful or accurate for them? I wouldn't typically do that in the way I run the lesson, but I don't necessarily think I would object to it. I think there is a real tension here about understanding what's problematic with the terms, but also understanding that these are common terms used by state and federal agencies, and knowing that we need to be able to navigate that as well if we're going to understand some of these data that we get from government resources or government institutions. I do want to just for a second talk about the terms Hispanic and the related term Latino or Latina. The data, a lot of data from government organizations use the term Hispanic or sometimes the related term Latino. Latino is really more about geography. Does someone trace their roots back to or identify themselves as coming from Latin America? Whereas Hispanic is more about, more about having connections to Spanish language and culture, but it's also in everyday use, used as sort of a proxy for Latino. And so as just to clarify, like for Brazil, for instance, would not be a Hispanic country because it wasn't colonized by Spain and it doesn't have that legacy in the same way. It has, it was colonized by Portugal, I believe. But in everyday US language, these terms are sort of conflated or used interchangeably sometimes, and that can be confusing or it can make the data unclear. Another thing that can be complex here is that Hispanic sometimes overlaps with racial groups. So for when the instance when the US Census collects data about people, you can check off your race. So I could check off that I'm white, and then I could separately check off my ethnicity, which would be, I could either check Hispanic or not Hispanic. There are many categories, but in terms of Hispanic, I can check that. So I could be white and Hispanic, or I could be white and not Hispanic. I could be Black and Hispanic, or I could be Black and not Hispanic. And it's not always clear in your data sets when it's allowed to overlap and when it's not. The data reported here in Ohio, from the best I can tell, does not overlap. So Hispanic is separate from these other categories. And then of course, not everyone really identifies with this term in terms of how they think about or identify themselves. In terms of Latino and Latina are gendered terms. I'm sorry, my pronunciation may not be great, but Latine is a kind of emerging term that's being used that's more gender neutral and trans inclusive, but not everyone uses that term either. Another one you may have heard of is Latinx, but a lot of Spanish speakers don't love that because it doesn't sort of flow well with the language from what I understand. All right, so again, let's look at the data. As a reminder, the task is to talk to Hamilton County about whether they should be worried about segregation. Is there an issue when you look across their school districts? And they would have data like this, and again, it would be in spreadsheet form so they can manipulate it. So I want to ask you to think for a second and then again, share in the chat. How would you approach a task like this? How might you think about analyzing a set of data like this to give Hamilton County some feedback on whether there's an issue with segregation? Okay, one suggestion is to change the raw numbers to percentages within each district. And as you'll see in a minute, that is one of the first things most groups usually do. Great suggestion. Part of what we need to think about is then what do we do when we have those percentages? How are we going to decide what to tell Hamilton County? Cross comparisons across those percentages. All right, so I'm going to share a few of the different types of strategies I've seen with this task. I don't think this covers everything, but it covers a range of types of strategies. So as I said, a common first step is to convert to percentages. It's I don't know that it happens always, but most groups tend to do this as a first step in terms of having a common way to compare the numbers. Another common thing to do is think about how to represent the data in some way. I will say, as I've switched to doing this more with a computer spreadsheet like Google Sheets, that becomes more common because it's much easier to create graphs quickly. So one type of graph I might see is a stacked bar graph. So this shows every race, every racial group within each school, and you can sort of look across them and do a quick scan of how they compare. And we've got the total here at the end. Another way that I've seen groups do this is to do double bar graphs. Maybe they want to simplify the data so they look at just white students compared to students of color. And that might look something like this. And of course, something you might want to talk about is, you know, what kids might think about that, or how that might make people feel when they're all collapsed into one big group. And, you know, there's already a lot of diversity within each group, and then we're collapsing it into one, but it does help see, it makes this graph much simpler instead of having, you know, 5 or 6 bars for each school district. Another thing people like, a lot of my students really like pie charts, or it's sort of a nice, easy way to see the overall makeup of a district. They can't make one for every district usually, at least not quickly and in a way that's easy to compare, but they might select some key districts. So on the left here, we have the Three Rivers Local School District, and that is the whitest school district by percentage in the county compared to the overall demographic data for the whole county. Just for this is for all students, we add up the total. And then there's this question of, okay, well, so how do we identify if there's a problem, or how do we identify if something's sort of out of whack in some sense, or that we have an issue with segregation? And this is usually pretty tricky, and there's not always, there's definitely not an answer for how to do this. Some people just do a visual scan of the graphs. When a couple of those earlier graphs we saw, it's pretty clear that some school districts have a very different demographic makeup than the overall county. Sometimes people make sort of a cutoff. They might say, well, if a district has more than 60% of one race, or some other cutoff. Or they might say, if we look at each individual percentage and any of them for each race are off from the overall county, if they're off by, say, plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 25%, then we've got some kind of problem with that district that indicates some segregation. Another strategy I saw last time I did this, which was a little interesting to me, was they classified some of the districts. For example, they said some of them were predominantly white, some of them were predominantly black. And then they looked up the state report card for those districts. In Ohio, the Department of Education gives every district a letter grade. So they found those letter grades for each of the districts, and then they essentially did like a GPA average for say all the predominantly white districts versus all the predominantly black districts. And they saw that the average letter grade was quite a bit different across those. So they said not only are there different demographics across our school districts, the quality of education we're providing them, at least as shown by these letter grades, is different. And that's a real indicator of a problem. So that's an example where the group went and got additional data outside of what I gave them and brought that into their mathematical model, or how they were thinking about the context. So, if you have thoughts about how you think your students might handle this, or what kinds of conversations you might want to have about these topics, if your students were exploring it, please share that in the chat as well. All right, I am watching the clock, so I'm going to move forward, but if people have ideas to put in the chat, please feel free to do so. We've got one question. Do students share this work with their parents? And if so, do parents comment on the activities? So the school segregation one was, again, that was just undergraduates that I've worked with this task. So that's adults preparing to be teachers. So that hasn't come up as much. I don't know about this task in particular. Sometimes I have had students comment on conversations they've had with friends or partners or things like that about the tasks we've done. For the summer camp, the camp was explicitly around social issues, and there was a little information about the kinds of topics we did ahead of time. We did sometimes ask kids to go home and tell their family or an adult about what they were working on. But we didn't necessarily have a lot of back and forth on that. But I think that especially with more time, or if you're doing any kind of unit or a cross-disciplinary unit, that's an excellent idea. I will say, in terms of thinking about in classroom context, communicating ahead of time so families know what's coming and they're aware of some of the topics that are coming up can be a good way to sort of set the stage for that. In terms of conversation, someone commented that it'd be good to have a conversation about how districts within the county represent towns or communities within the county. Right, so thinking about where these different districts are and how they're formed. Someone commented they like the discussion around identifying segregation mathematically. Yeah, and there's a lot of work on this, and the method we've used here is actually different than what a lot of social scientists might do, where they would collect data and say something like, how many, say, white students are attending schools that are predominantly white, like over 90% white? How many black students are attending schools that are predominantly black? And it's a slightly different method of analysis, but I think it's also a little harder to unpack. So I like this method in terms of accessibility. All right, so in terms of discussion with kids, with my adult students, I often ask them questions like, what are some advantages of integration in general or school integration in particular? And what are some of the problems with segregation? So we might talk a little bit about that. We might talk about why some students and families of color might be wary of integration. So if you are, a Black student who's experienced racism, do you want to be put in a school context where you're maybe more likely to experience more of that if you're with more white peers or things like that? That's a concern some students and families have, and real things people experience. And then I often ask what people know about why things are like this. One issue that comes up a lot is sort of what we should or should not do about this. Should we be busing kids? What are we supposed to do if the district itself is predominantly white? Wouldn't it be reasonable that the schools within that district are predominantly white? And so what's sort of the issue with that? And in a second, I'll share some resources related to that. One of the points I like to make is that the districts weren't drawn by accident, and there is a history and momentum behind why both our cities and our schools are segregated. There's a question in the chat about, have we compared this data to older data where district lines might have been different? I have not done that. It might be a really interesting task to do. I don't know how far back the data go. The ones I got are from the Ohio Department of Education. And so I don't know how far back those data go, but if those are available, that might be a really interesting comparison to make. In terms of some resources or additional information, one resource I like to provide to my students, they don't always have time to look at it, sort of optional if you finish and your group is waiting to share. The racial dot map is a powerful way to visualize segregation in the US. It's for the whole population. It's not just for students or schools. Each dot represents a different racial group, as you can see over here on the left. And this is Cincinnati area, but you can zoom in or out anywhere in the US. It's based on the 2010 census data. So it's a really powerful way to just sort of visualize some of these ways that our neighborhoods and communities are segregated. I usually also assign some homework. My students are usually familiar with Brown v. Board of Education. That was the Supreme Court ruling that banned segregation in schools. However, they're not usually familiar with what has happened since then. A lot of times they view this as an issue from the past, and they're surprised to learn that it's an ongoing issue. These are two articles I've shared before, and they'll be in the resources that are on the website for this talk, so you can download them with links. One article is from the Cincinnati Enquirer, and it was written in, both of these were written as sort of the 60-year anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And essentially they're both talking about how segregation went down following Brown, but then it has increased quite a bit since then and has continued to rise. Again, my students are often familiar with Brown, that major ruling by the Supreme Court, but they're not aware that there was a subsequent ruling called Brown 2. And I usually just have them read the Wikipedia page on Brown. It has a little subsection on Brown 2, just so that they're aware of it. That ruling was a ruling that said, yes, you have to, states and school districts, you have to desegregate, just do it with, quote, all deliberate speed. And that was really viewed as essentially allowing states a free pass to really take their time with desegregation, and is seen as kind of undermining the original ruling. And then finally, I like both of these videos. They're both on YouTube. And again, there'll be links to them in the resources. The Disturbing History of the Suburbs is a video by Adam Ruins Everything. And Housing Segregation and Redlining in America is a video from NPR Code Switch. They do a really nice job of talking about redlining, which was a practice where the government and banks would identify neighborhoods and they would color code them. And ones that were colored red were considered not desirable for giving home loans. And of course, that happened to overlap, or intentionally overlap, actually, with communities with a large number of people of color, especially African Americans. And so the videos help unpack that history and how it continues into today in terms of intergenerational wealth, how we fund schools, and segregation in our cities. So I like these resources as a way to unpack the fact that segregation and the inequities we see are not just the way things are. It's not just sort of by accident, but are the result of policies, intentional policies that both existed in the past, and then because we haven't rectified them, continue and affect things today. All right, so I just want to wrap up with some concluding thoughts. I want to say thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking to you about it. I do have a website or a YouTube channel where I talk about math sometimes, and a website where I blog about math and write about it. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or see if Maria can unmute you, and I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, thanks a lot for joining me.
Thank you, Matt. That was terrific. Yeah, if you want to be unmuted, I can do that for you. If anybody has a question or a comment, we have Christy and Kathy with us. Okay, so Kathy wants to be unmuted, I think. Let me see if I can do that. There you go, Kathy. I think I allowed you to talk. You just have to unmute yourself now, or maybe I do it.
Oh, I can do that. I don't have a question. I just figured I would say something. I just wanted to say thank you. This is great. Thank you, Maria. Thanks, Matt. Really great and exciting things that you're doing. And I love that you're having the discussions. You're bringing in both the math as well as a lot of other things that students need to learn about. So thank you. It's very interesting. Great.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming.
And Christy says thank you. And then I have a minute to do a commercial for the school. Maybe I'll let you do it, Kathy.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll do the commercial for the middle school thing, and then I do have a question for you, Matt, because your stuff was fantastic. It really had my brain thinking a lot about how we hope to be broadening this view of what it means to do mathematics, and how these mathematical kind of adventures and activities can really empower students. So I'll ask you that question in a second, but I think I can share my screen and show you our infomercial for our exciting news. And that is that COMAP is going to now have a middle school math component to the math modeling contest. So it's going to be mid-MCM. And it's going to kind of be a component in the HiMCM, which is the high school mathematical modeling contest. And Kathy, again, you can jump in and correct me if that's wrong. We do have the college level ones too, the international mathematical, the MCM and the ICM. And those are content. The HiMCM happens in the fall. And I think that's when the middle school level will also happen. And we're looking for folks who want to be part of, to be involved in particularly in the middle school, because it's a brand new contest for COMAP and for students. And, like Matt said, we've been talking about mathematical modeling in the Common Core for a lot of years now, and folks are doing some really interesting work in K through 16. So it's great to see that middle schoolers will have a chance to participate in the contest. Kathy, did you want to add anything else?
No, thanks, Maria. We're just really excited about this. People have asked us to do this for a couple of years, and so we're going to expand it. This November will be the first year to have the contest problem option for just middle school level students.
And then, Matt, what I was thinking about when you were kind of sharing your work is that I was thinking about how when I do work with teachers, one of the first things they say is, where does the math for this modeling task fit into my standards? And you made a comment about that if you open it up, then sometimes the kids don't always hit that math. But I'm also wondering if anybody has been talking about changing the standards to include some of the valuable things that students learn when they're doing these tasks, like even just learning about the world around them, like how much it costs to live, that kind of thing. So I don't know if you are aware of any information that, again, that people might be thinking about broadening this way of measuring what students are learning, and that these skills are quite valuable.
I'm not aware of an initiative or effort like that. I do agree with you. I mean, I think it's super important. I think it's a real shortcoming of standards usually, because I understand why we want grade specific and sort of item by item standards, but I think there's a real limitation there. And then, of course, the other place that limitation really shows up to me is in the way we assess students. I'm not a huge fan of our over reliance on assessments, but that I think that's particularly limiting because assessing those kinds of skills are really difficult. So, I'm all in favor of it. And I think that's a conversation we need to be having. It's a conversation I think about also with my equity and social justice work more generally. There's part of the conversation is, okay, how do I do this task and how do I find standards and show that it connects? And knowing your standards is powerful and being able to say, look, here's what we did and here's where it connects to this practice. Or if I am in high school, here's where it connects to this conceptual category of modeling. And, some of my students did say proportional reasoning. Some of my students did graphing and representation. And so I can make those connections. We need to be able to do that as teachers and talk like that. But we also should be pushing the conversation about, the version of math that we have out there is in some ways too limited. It's too narrow because it makes it harder to do these kinds of tasks. So we need to be pushing back on policymakers, the people who get to set that agenda in terms of what do we want to count as doing mathematics. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a super important conversation to have. And I will say, I think it's really tied up with testing. It's hard to change that conversation when we're so invested in tests and specifically, usually multiple choice or limited type answer tests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for those of you here, we'll have a recording of this that you can share with your colleagues, and Matt's materials will all be up on the mathmodels.org website. And we're super grateful to COMAP for providing the support for this series, and hopefully we'll be doing more next year. So just let us know if you have questions. You have Matt's information, and my name is Maria Hernandez. I forgot to say hello, but I can drop my email in the chat if you have questions. And I'll say thank you to Matt, and thank you to those of you who attended. My email.
Well, thank you again for having me, and thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
Yes, thanks so much. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.